So this is the part of the show I was telling you about today earlier. If you're following me on Twitter at LateKickJosh, and I also led the show with it tonight. A little bit different feel here. So I'm scrolling through Twitter earlier today. I saw Zach Barnett from Football Scoop. He put out his 15 most important wins of the Nick Saban era at Alabama. And so I looked at him, and if you're a college football fan that's not 5 years old, most of you are going to remember these games. For Bama fans, you're going to remember every one of them, but this has been the national program for well over a decade now. So most of you are watching every Bama game, or at the very least you know what's happening. A lot of these are postseason games. And I was looking at the list, and I remember every game. I could name you the final score of most of them, but I also remembered, or realized rather, I got a memory from every single one of these things. So I'm going to run down this list. What I want you to do, whether you're riding around tomorrow listening to the podcast, or you're sitting there at your computer chair watching the show right now, think along here, because I guarantee you got more memories than you think you do in that bank of yours when I list these games. Number 15, Bama 41, Tennessee 17. This was a 2007 game. I want you to remember, Bama barely makes a bowl game in 2007. It's Saban's first year. But even in that year, they beat Tennessee. Saban's never lost to Tennessee. It's been there a decade and a half at this point. What I remember about this game is right before kickoff, I didn't know anything about sports betting at the time. I thought Tennessee -3 was a lock because they announced that 5 or 6 Bama players were suspended for textbook violations. I don't mean a violation that's textbook in nature, literal textbook violations. Boy, hasn't the SEC changed since then. So, yeah, they're going to be without 5 guys. A lot of them are starters. And already, I just think Tennessee's the better team. It's Saban's first year. They would go on to lose to Louisiana Monroe in this season. And so if I could have gotten to a sports book, I would have laid healthy money on Tennessee -3. Bama starts the game with an onside kick. They never look back, 41-17. That's the number 15 game. How about 14? Bama, 2008 Iron Bowl, 36-0 winner over Auburn. Tuberville, head coach at Auburn at the time, was true to form until the end. They had run up, I think, a 6-game winning streak against Bama. I was at this game, and I remember seeing him get off that bus, and he was holding up 7 fingers, 7 in a row. They were a healthy underdog. They got skull-drugged. They got splattered all over Tuscaloosa. But I'll tell you what I remember the most. Before that game, Saran Stacy, who's an Alabama legend, if you don't know his story, I would encourage you to Google it. His family had been in a horrible automobile accident. He lost children in that accident. And they had him on the field pregame. They presented him with an honorary game ball. One of the most emotional scenes I've ever seen in a college football stadium. The game wasn't even going on, but it was just kind of an outpouring from, at that time, I guess, 92,000 some odd people of support and adoration, just letting someone know, you're one of ours, we're here for you. And then Alabama followed through with their end of the deal. But man, I remember that was a very, very rabid crowd because they tasted something, a rivalry win in the Iron Bowl that they hadn't tasted in quite a while. The number 13 game is very recent. It's the 2020 SEC Championship game. Bama over Florida, 52-46. And everyone's memory of this game's fresh. I won't spend much time on it, but I just remember thinking, how in the world did this team lose to LSU? This is the Florida team that had just lost to LSU. And so I remember, we were at this desk. It was on this show. I told you, I think Florida's going to play the game of the year against Alabama. They did. This was the best game Florida played all year. They ran up against the best team in the country. But in retrospect, I think this is the toughest game Bama had all year. And it was against a Florida team that ultimately couldn't capitalize on a golden opportunity. Because I know people look back on it as a failure of a season. Well, not a failure of a season, a failure of taking advantage of an opportunity. But man, if they beat LSU, they're on the fringes of being in the playoff conversation. You never also know how that would have impacted this game. But man, you don't remember it because they lost to Bama, and then they lost in humiliating fashion to Oklahoma. The number 12 game is, nail-biter, 2009. Lane Kiffin, in his first and only year at Tennessee, takes the Volunteers into Bryant-Denny Stadium. Bama beats them 12-10. So my view of this was stunned disbelief that Lane Kiffin was able to mount that kind of effort in year one, really outmanned as a roster. They also held Urban Meyer in Florida in that same season a lot closer than people really expected them to. I'll tell you what I remember about this game. There was cell phone footage. And this is 2009, so it wasn't just all over the place. Someone shot cell phone footage of the ending of this game. It's probably still on YouTube, and the crowd noise sounded like a jet engine. This is the game where Bama had to block a field goal at the end of regulation to preserve a lead and an eventual victory there. But it was a classic survive and advance situation because, public tendency is to watch the number one ranked team in the country, which was Bama at this time. You lose to an unranked, or you barely beat an unranked team. And you say, oh, that's when they get down the road, they play better teams. It's going to cost them. It never did. This was an undefeated team. It was a survive and advance game. Number 11, this one was very emotional. 2018 SEC championship game. Bama 35, Georgia 28 was on the field for this one. We'll never forget it. I think it may be my favorite Bama game that I've been at because it was the one where it was the total inverse of the year before. Tua is struggling, so they bring Jalen Hurts in. He's been on the bench all year. They bring him in. Sure enough, he leads a comeback against the same team he got benched against the year before. Storyline after storyline after storyline. What I remember is watching him take them down the field, and they end up beating Georgia. The raw emotion on the field after that game was incredible. You saw it in the postgame if you were watching on CBS, but up the tunnel afterwards, once Nick Saban in particular kind of got out of public view, bawled his eyes out. Standing right there, watching it. Just very, very atypical. It's something you could only have seen if you were standing right there, but it also showed the emotional investment that he had in a guy like Jalen Hurts. Because Jalen Hurts had every reason to leave, and he didn't leave, bought into every aspect of what they had long since built there in terms of a team culture. And then he was there. Not only was he there, he was ready when his number was called, and he looked better as a passer than he had the year before, even though he hadn't started. So that was incredible to see. The number 10 games, Bama versus Texas A&M, 49-42. This is 2013, their second shot at Manziel. Now, 49-42 doesn't look out of place now. Back then, this was really that first time you saw Nick Saban be made to look really uncomfortable. And the first time that you really watched them play a game where it felt like they needed 50 to win. And that's basically what they had to do. They had to score 50 to win. I also remember it was like 110 degrees on the field for that one. But it was a very uncomfortable spot for them, and it was a precursor. If you go back and you look at what they had to go through to win that thing, it was a precursor to what they were eventually going to have to do several more times over the coming 7 or 8 years to get us to present day. And probably went a long way in convincing Nick Saban I'm going to have to change some things about my defense, but also I'm going to need to do that offensively too. Number 9, Bama 38, Georgia 10. This was a game in 2015 in Athens, Georgia. It poured down rain. I was on the field for this one too, ruined a lot of equipment. This was a classic situation. I think it was a defining situation for Mark Richt at Georgia. That was a fan base and that was a program that was dead set convinced they were ready to compete against the best in the country that day, and they weren't, and it wasn't close. And they got splattered all over their home stadium. And to make it worse, or really to make it infinitely worse, they had to go home waterlogged afterwards. In fairness, most of them were gone by the beginning of the fourth quarter. But I will tell you, one of my memories from this one is they were up 5 touchdowns on Georgia. This was when I think it was Nick Chubb, whoever the running back for Georgia was, had that long streak of 100-plus rushing yard games, and he was being held well under that. And they end up breaking a long run, does Georgia, to make it 38-10. And I'm behind Bama's bench, and Jaron Reed goes after Reuben Foster's throat, literally, because Reuben Foster didn't fit a gap the right way, and that's what sprung a leak, and that's what allowed Georgia to score and allowed them to get that 100-yard rusher. Jaron Reed had to be restrained. I mean, something really violent and really terrible was going to happen to Reuben Foster had he not been restrained on the sideline. That's not even the only time I saw a fight on Bama's sideline that year, and they went on to win the national championship. Number 8, this past January, so I won't talk much about this one. Bama 52, Ohio State 24. Just at that point, Bama unstoppable, and it didn't help Ohio State that they were without a number of guys. So I think we all remember that one. That's the one I will speak the least about, even though, sadly, it's probably the one Jesse has the most material for. Sorry, Jesse. Number 7. This was a national championship game that I just mentioned. 2016. It was in Glendale, Arizona. It was Bama 45, Clemson 40. I wanted to fly into Sky Harbor, which is the Phoenix International Airport, and the prices were absurd. And I was working at a station in Columbus, Georgia at the time. We were the only station out of 3 in Columbus that got credentialed for the game, but yet they couldn't sell advertising for it. So I'm told I'm not going to have my trip paid for. Well, I was already credentialed. So I said, you know what? I'll go myself. I flew into San Diego, much more affordable, drove 6 hours across the desert, went to the game essentially as a spectator, even though I was credentialed. So I just stood on the field and watched because I wasn't going to work for free, far be it, for me to work for free. And it was the time where Clemson was still trying to shed that whole Clemsoning thing, which I never said on my show, but a lot of people did. I thought they validated themselves a lot, even in a loss there. And so what I remember the most about that is Bama gets the win. Afterwards, Jonathan Allen and that defense, they're unhappy with themselves because they gave up 40. So there are more scuffles on the Bama sideline as they're winning a title. As the clock's ticking down, they're aggravated. I mean, they're going after each other, and then they have to be celebrated and say, let's celebrate the championship, then we can fight in the locker room. What's next here? Boy, this was a classic. 2012 SEC Championship. Bama 32, Georgia 28. This was my first taste of sports talk radio in Columbus, Georgia, right on the Chattahoochee River. It's the border of Alabama and Georgia. Perfect positioning. You cannot imagine the buildup for this thing. And Georgia's got the lead, and Bama with T.J. Yeldon and Eddie Lacy, they just take over on the ground in the second half. They just run right at Jarvis Jones over and over and over again, and they end up winning that thing. And you cannot imagine, with the way that thing ended, Georgia, I think they run out of time on like the 6-yard line. You cannot imagine how many calls we took on sports radio in Columbus over the next however many months of callers saying we were one play short. We just ran out of time. And that's a fan base that convinces themselves, you know, we pretty much had equal opportunity to go kill Notre Dame in the national title game, and they did. That's how close Mark Richt came to a national title. Could have been one play. Of course, I always offered the counter argument, well, if we're adding time on the clock, let's just add 2 minutes and give Bama another chance after you score. It's not the way football works, obviously. The number 5 game is a very weird game. I was at this one. This was the national title game, 2009. It was at the Rose Bowl. It was Bama 37, Texas 21. This is the one where Colt McCoy goes out at the beginning of the game. Now, I tell you it was weird because you have this complete paradox of emotion. Bama has yet to win a title under Saban. They won their first title this night. But I remember a lot of folks, at least that I was around, it seemed like they were having to manufacture what they thought the celebratory nature was supposed to be, winning a title, because there was that lingering voice in the back of their mind. It's still lingering in Austin, Texas now. No one talks about it elsewhere, but it's still lingering. And it's 4 words, I guess, if Colt hadn't gotten hurt, 5 words. What would have happened? And there was that lingering, just kind of not doubt, but kind of question in the back of Bama fans' minds. And so it was a weird feeling because I was at that game and the SEC title game a month earlier. The SEC title game was more emotional. We're about to talk about it in a second. Fortunately, I had other memories from that game. That was the one where I got flown out to L.A., stayed in Brentwood, right off of Sunset Boulevard, in the cul-de-sac where O.J. Simpson had once lived. Ben Affleck still lived there. Conan O'Brien still lived there. So I go from living in west central Georgia, where, you know, the loudest sound at night are cicadas, to being in the middle of L.A., and being around a bunch of people who have more zeros on the end of their net worth than I've ever seen in my life. And so that was a fun trip, even independent of the game. First and only trip I've taken to the Rose Bowl. How about the number 4 game? This was the 2018 it's so weird to see so many Bama Georgia games on here. This is the best one to me. This was the 2018 National Championship game. This is 2nd and 26. This is overtime. This is, again, a dream scenario. I'm working in Columbus, Georgia. I'm in TV. You have got the 2 premier brands in the market along with Auburn going at it, and it's in Atlanta. And so I don't know how you could write it any better. Well, here's how you could write it better. Have the game go to overtime. Have a total flip of emotion. Have a true freshman named Tua Tagovailoa come off the bench and lead your team back, and then watch him cap it in overtime famously and be on the field for it all. That was my night. That was my experience. That was my view. Even though the game was in Atlanta, 1 hour up the road from where we were situated in Columbus, I did not get back home until the sun came up the next day. Time stood still. It was really a weird night. It was a surreal night. Still, it's hard to process all that we were able to experience that night. Memory that will last the rest of your life. The number 3 game's way back, 2008. It was the blackout game. Bama 41, Georgia 30. This is Matt Stafford for Georgia. This is Noshawn Moreno for Georgia. This is A.J. Green for Georgia. And this is the Dogs trailing 31-0 at halftime in their own building, prime time in front of the world. There were heated discussions on the softball fields of Columbus, Georgia in the week leading up to this game about what was going to happen. Because Bama had not become established as the king of the SEC by any stretch. They were 7 or 8 point underdog in this game. And it was so emphatic. The result looks weird because it's 41-30. Game was over at halftime. It's still not when they fully took over. It's just when they served notice to a lot of the country. I'll tell you when they took over in a second. The number 2 game is the 2011 title game, the rematch between Bama and LSU. It was a blanking. I remember the supreme confidence Bama had going into that game. Even though they lost to LSU earlier in the year, they were so convinced they were the better team. I thought they were the better team too. You got to go prove it on the field. They did it in New Orleans. Kevin Norwood, huge in that game. I just remember asking myself early on, how does an LSU team playing in their own backyard look so helpless here? There was no secondary pitch. The fastball didn't work, and that was it. That was all she wrote. But the number 1 game was the 2009 SEC Championship game. I was at this one. Absolutely number 1. I totally agree with the guys at Football Scoop. Florida is coming into this game with a chance to be all-time historic. They just won the title the year before. They're going for the repeat. They're more than a touchdown favorite in this game. And Bama, Kirby Smart, Nick Saban, they put on a defensive clinic. This is the Rolando McClain era, the Dante Hightower era. It's the night Nick Saban and Alabama took control of the SEC, and they've never relinquished it. I have never been around more raw emotion. That's the game where they showed Tebow crying on the Jumbotron, and it was as if you were in the Roman Colosseum, and the entire arena is just frothing at the mouth. Kill, kill. Not quite that violent, but that's what it was like. Because at this point, they hadn't racked up a bunch of titles. They still had that collective chip on the shoulder mentality as a fan base. And so it was unlike Bama games are even today, where you've got a sense of entitlement. You can deny it if you want to. It's there. They didn't have it at that point. They went into that game as an underdog. They came out of the Georgia Dome that night, rest in peace, Georgia Dome, as the favorite going into the national title game and the favorite every year in the SEC from that point forward. So those were some of the memories I had from those Alabama games. That was really fun to read through today, and it was very opportune that we could do it in June.